On a random Tuesday in August 2024, a company that had carried 60 million passengers had grown faster than any airline in America and had single-handedly resurrected a dying industry, sent its customers a text message informing them that their bus no longer existed. That's right, just a refund and a street corner with nobody coming. This is the story of how a $1 bus ticket built an empire, and why 60 million loyal riders couldn't save it when the empire started to fall. Chapter 1. Did the headlines tell the actual truth? Before we get into the collapse, and we will get very much into the collapse, let's establish what was actually lost when Megabus disappeared, because the headline version of this story, which read simply as "Budget Bus Company Goes Bankrupt," drastically undersells what actually happened. At its peak, Megabus was growing at 65% per year. Not 65% total, not 65% over a decade. 65% in a single year, which is a growth rate that made airline executives uncomfortable and transportation researchers at major universities start coining new terminology to describe what they were watching. The Megabus effect was a real phrase that real academics used to describe what happened to American travel patterns when a blue double-decker bus started picking people up off street corners for $1. Curbside bus travel as a category grew 33% during the period Megabus was expanding. Megabus itself grew 48%. Amtrak grew 6%. Airlines grew 5%. The intercity bus, which had spent 40 years becoming cultural shorthand for desperation and neglect, was suddenly the fastest-growing transportation category in the United States. It didn't just grow, it forced change. Greyhound, the company whose name had become synonymous with broken stations and broken schedules, and the general sense that nobody powerful enough to fix things cared about the people who rode buses, launched an entirely new service called Greyhound Express, with Wi-Fi and express routes and competitive pricing, a direct imitation of the model that was eating their market share. A company that had been comfortable and stagnant for decades was forced to reinvent itself just to stay relevant, because a blue bus with a £1 fare in London had asked a question that turned out to have enormous implications for American transportation. And then, 22 years after that first bus pulled out of London, it was over. The 120 cities, the 60 million lifetime passengers, the double-deckers named Albus Dumbledore and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the dollar fares that made college weekends and job interviews and family emergencies financially possible for people who had no other affordable option. All of it gone, in a dissolution so abrupt that passengers with valid tickets found out their route no longer existed via text message on a Tuesday morning. Understanding how that happened requires going back to the very beginning, to an August morning in 2003, and a question that was simultaneously obvious and radical. Chapter 2. A psychology experiment disguised as a bus company. The story starts in Britain in August 2003, when a blue and yellow double-decker bus pulled out of London heading to Oxford with a claim printed on its side that most people assumed was either a misprint or a marketing stunt. You could ride it for £1. £1. At a time when train fares between the same cities were running multiples of that and rising, Megabus was offering to move you between major British cities for the price of a candy bar. Here's the thing that most people get wrong about Megabus from the very beginning. It was not a bus company. Not really. It was a pricing experiment wearing a bus company's clothing, and the people who built it, the team at Stagecoach Group, already one of Britain's largest transport operators, hadn't been looking at other bus companies when they designed the model. They'd been looking at Ryanair. They'd been looking at EasyJet. They'd watched budget airlines do something the transport establishment had insisted was impossible, which was to make flying genuinely cheap while simultaneously making it grow. And they'd absorbed the specific insight underneath that achievement. The insight was almost embarrassingly simple once you understood it. A seat that goes unsold the day before departure is worth exactly zero. It doesn't matter what you paid for the plane, what you paid for the pilot, what you pay in airport fees and fuel costs. If the seat is empty when the vehicle moves, all of those costs were borne without any corresponding revenue from that unit. So why not sell the last empty seats for almost nothing, fill the vehicle completely, and use dynamic pricing to ensure that people who book early pay very little while people who book late pay more, with the overall average landing somewhere that sustains the operation? Stagecoach applied that logic to coaches, and added a layer of operational discipline that stripped every cost that wasn't absolutely necessary to the function. Tickets online only. No agents, no kiosks, no paper, no assigned seats, no waiting rooms, no terminal costs. You booked, you showed up at a designated street corner, you got on the bus. The infrastructure investment was minimal in ways that made the £1 fare not just possible but sustainable, because the cost base underlying it had been engineered down to a level that traditional bus operators had never seriously attempted. Within 12 months, Megabus had carried over 1 million passengers on British routes. The incumbent operators, National Express, Scottish CityLink, panicked and slashed their own fares, which is exactly what happens when a new entrant detonates a pricing bomb in the middle of an industry that had been comfortable and unchallenged for decades. Megabus hadn't just launched a service, it had created a competitive dynamic that forced the entire British coach industry to reconfigure itself around a new price floor. Stagecoach looked at what it had built and decided Britain wasn't big enough for it. Chapter 3. The American Gamble, April 10, 2006, Chicago. And to understand how audacious this move actually was, you need to understand the state of American intercity bus travel at the moment Megabus arrived, because the contrast between what the industry looked like and what Megabus was about to do to it is genuinely remarkable. In 1960, Chicago alone had 454 daily bus arrivals and departures. By 1980, that number had fallen to 290. By 2002, it had collapsed to 147. The national picture tracked the same trajectory. Intercity bus service had been cut by more than half over 4 decades, a slow-motion abandonment of a mode of transport that had once been genuinely central to how Americans moved between cities. The word Greyhound had completed its evolution from a brand name into a cultural shorthand for hard times and the kind of travel that people did when they had no other choice. Broken stations, unreliable schedules, an atmosphere of neglect so institutional that it had become invisible to the people responsible for it. Serious transportation analysts were writing seriously about whether the American intercity bus had any viable future at all. Into this landscape arrived a blue double-decker bus with Wi-Fi on board, power outlets at every seat, fares starting at $1, and the audacity to position itself not as the last resort of the desperate, but as the smart choice of the budget-conscious. The curbside pickup model that Megabus brought from Britain removed the most visible symbol of everything wrong with American bus travel, the terminal, and replaced it with the simplest possible transaction. You booked online, you showed up at a corner, you got on. No waiting room smelling of institutional despair. No ticket counter staffed by someone who had stopped caring years ago. Just a bus, a curb, and a fare that made the train look expensive and the plane look absurd. The response was immediate and larger than anyone had modeled. Within 2 years, Megabus had served 1 million North American riders. By 2011, just 5 years into the American operation, 16 million passengers across 70 cities. The DePaul University researchers who coined the Megabus effect documented something that the industry's conventional wisdom had said was impossible: that there was enormous latent demand for quality intercity bus travel in America, demand that had been suppressed not by genuine preference for other modes, but by the abysmal product that the existing operators had been offering for decades. Greyhound's response confirmed the scale of what Megabus had achieved. Greyhound Express launched as a direct imitation of the Megabus model. Wi-Fi, express routes, competitive pricing, an almost shameless acknowledgement that the company that had defined American bus travel for half a century needed to borrow its future from the operation that had shown it what the future could look like. By 2014, Megabus was at 35 million lifetime passengers across 120 cities, running routes from New York to Toronto and Chicago to Detroit and Atlanta to Washington. And the company felt, to everyone inside it, and most observers outside it, genuinely untouchable. It was not untouchable. And the cracks, when they appeared, came from directions that nobody inside the operation was watching closely enough. Chapter 4. The First Crack. Here's the detail about Megabus's decline that gets consistently underweighted in the standard narrative, because most people who tell the collapse story jump straight to COVID and private equity and Flixbus without properly accounting for the erosion that was already happening before any of those forces arrived. The curbside pickup model was Megabus's most brilliant operational innovation and, over time, its most significant customer experience liability, and the transition from one to the other happened so gradually that it's easy to miss in retrospect. In 2006, showing up at a street corner to catch a $1 bus felt genuinely innovative. The absence of a terminal wasn't a deprivation, it was a feature, a signal that this was a new kind of travel experience that had stripped away the worst parts of the old model without replacing them with anything equally bad. The Wi-Fi and power outlets reinforced that message. You were getting more than you used to get for a fraction of what you used to pay, and the curbside pickup was part of the package rather than a compromise within it. As the years accumulated, the customer psychology around the curbside model shifted in ways that the company wasn't adequately tracking. Transportation researchers began documenting a change in how riders experienced the no-terminal approach. What had felt innovative in 2006 started feeling cheap in the wrong way by the mid-2000s. Standing on a corner in the rain with no shelter, no information board, no bathroom access, and no reliable update when the bus was running 40 minutes late was a customer experience that riders had been willing to accept when the alternative was Greyhound. As the overall travel landscape improved and competitors emerged with more polished products, the tolerance for curbside inconvenience declined. One transportation scholar put it directly, "People didn't want curbside pickups anymore. When it started, people were willing to give it a try, but they saw it was a downside." The company had built its cost structure and its operational model around an innovation that its own customers were gradually deciding they didn't want. And upgrading to proper terminals and infrastructure would have required capital investment that compromised the low-cost foundation the entire model rested on. It was a trap built into the original design, and Megabus never found a clean way out of it. This was the first crack, and the second one was already forming in Munich. Chapter 5. The Flixbus Threat. When a better model arrives. In 2011, 3 entrepreneurs in Munich launched a bus company called Flixbus that looked from a distance like just another budget coach operator entering a crowded European market. It was not. The architecture underneath was fundamentally different from anything Megabus was doing, and that difference would eventually prove decisive in the American market they were both competing for. Megabus owned its buses. Megabus employed its drivers. Megabus bore the capital cost of maintaining a physical fleet and the operational complexity of managing the people and vehicles that constituted its actual service infrastructure. This is the straightforward way to run a transportation company, the way transportation companies have always been run, and it comes with a set of structural constraints that are difficult to escape. High fixed costs, limited flexibility in responding to route-level performance, significant capital requirements for expansion, and a cost base that creates vulnerability during demand downturns because the assets continue to depreciate whether they're moving people or sitting idle. Flixbus owned almost none of that. Flixbus was a technology platform and a brand that contracted with local bus operators who provided the vehicles and the drivers, while Flixbus handled the booking system, the customer experience design, and the marketing. The asset-light model was lighter, faster, and almost infinitely more flexible. If a route underperformed, Flixbus could drop it without writing off a fleet of vehicles. If a new market opened, it could enter without the capital expenditure of buying buses. If fuel prices spiked, the impact on Flixbus's economics was structurally different from the impact on a company that owned the vehicles consuming the fuel. It was, as observers noted at the time, the Airbnb model applied to intercity bus travel, and it carried the same competitive advantages that the Airbnb model had demonstrated in hospitality. The platform could scale rapidly because the growth constraint wasn't capital-intensive asset acquisition but partnership development, which operates on a fundamentally different timeline and cost curve. Flixbus entered the United States in 2018, and within a year was operating on most of Megabus's significant corridors. The competitive pressure was real, but not yet existential. Megabus had 12 years of brand equity, an established customer base, and operational experience in the American market that Flixbus was still acquiring. What made the situation existential was what Flixbus did in 2021. It bought Greyhound. Think carefully about what that acquisition meant. Greyhound, the company Megabus had spent 15 years outcompeting and ultimately forcing to imitate its own model, was now owned by Megabus's most structurally dangerous rival. Flixbus and Greyhound together covered virtually every corridor Megabus operated, with Flixbus's asset-light cost advantages now backed by Greyhound's network scale and brand recognition. The competitive landscape that Megabus had navigated successfully for a decade and a half had transformed into something it had no reliable strategy for handling. Meanwhile, the external environment was shifting in ways that eroded the customer base that Megabus's entire model depended on. Gas prices fell, making driving more affordable. Airline ticket prices declined from their post-2008 peaks. The economic pressure that had pushed budget-conscious travelers toward Megabus in its growth years eased off, and the customers who had come out of necessity started drifting back toward cars and planes. The customers who might have come for experience were looking at Flixbus's newer branding, slicker app, and cleaner positioning, and at the persistent curbside inconveniences that Megabus had never adequately resolved. By the end of the decade, Megabus had lost the price war, lost the innovation war, and was facing the arrival of something that would finish what those losses had started. Chapter 6. COVID and the Collapse. Imagine for a moment what it feels like to run a company whose entire business is moving human beings from one city to another, and then watch the entire world stop moving. March 2020. COVID-19. Megabus's parent company, Coach USA, had no playbook for what happened next because nobody did. Buses went dark overnight. Routes ceased operating. The operating revenue that had been sustaining the business vanished with a speed that no financial model had anticipated because no financial model had ever needed to anticipate it. Coach USA's revenue collapsed by 60% in 2020 alone, which was devastating enough in isolation. And then you account for the broader context, which was that bus travel as an industry fell by more than 80% during the peak lockdown period. Not declined, not contracted, fell by 80%. The support infrastructure that existed for transportation businesses during the pandemic was distributed in ways that reflected long-standing political and institutional priorities rather than the actual distribution of need. Airlines received emergency bailout packages, emergency legislation, billions in public support, the full weight of government intervention in service of keeping a politically visible industry alive. Amtrak received public subsidy as it always had. Private intercity bus operators, the businesses that move low-income workers, students, elderly passengers, and people in mid-sized cities between the destinations that neither airlines nor Amtrak adequately serve, received minimal support. Half of all private bus operators in the United States went out of business during the pandemic. Half. Not struggling, not restructuring. Gone. Coach USA survived. But surviving required absorbing a debt load that the company had no realistic near-term path to repaying, because the recovery that the debt was predicated on never arrived with the speed or completeness that the financial models required. By 2021, Megabus ridership sat at 26% of pre-pandemic levels. By 2022, the entire industry had crawled back to 40% of where it had been. By 2023, 3 full years after the pandemic began, Coach USA's ridership had reached somewhere between 45% and 58% of pre-pandemic numbers. A figure that sounds like meaningful recovery until you set it against nearly $200 million in outstanding debt, rising fuel costs, climbing insurance premiums, a driver shortage forcing the cancellation of routes the company desperately needed revenue from, and Flixbus waiting on every profitable corridor with a structural cost advantage that Megabus had no viable strategy for matching. On June 11, 2024, Coach USA filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court in Wilmington, Delaware. The company that had carried 60 million passengers, grown 65% in a single year, and made a generation of Americans look at a bus and see possibility, instead of desperation, was formally insolvent. And if Chapter 11 was the wound, what came next was the part that actually killed it. Chapter 7. The Tuesday Text. 2 months after the bankruptcy filing, on August 15, 2024, Megabus announced that Peter Pan Busways would take over its Northeast operations: New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore. The following day, with a notice period that gave passengers essentially no time to make alternative arrangements, Megabus ceased operations across 5 major Texas cities. The Atlanta to Washington corridor disappeared. Fullerton Trailways absorbed some Pennsylvania routes. And if you had already bought a ticket, if you had already made plans around a departure that was no longer happening, you received a refund. A refund is a financial transaction. It doesn't get you to a job interview that was scheduled around a bus that no longer runs. It doesn't get you home for a family emergency in a city that suddenly has no bus service connecting it to yours. It doesn't solve anything for a person who chose Megabus specifically because they couldn't afford a last-minute plane ticket or a rental car. Which is to say, it doesn't solve anything for the exact demographic that Megabus had always served most directly, and that had always been most dependent on what it provided. The communities hit hardest by the collapse were not wealthy ones. They were never wealthy ones. The intercity bus has always served disproportionately the people with the fewest alternatives. Students traveling between college towns and home cities, low-income workers connecting to employment markets that aren't served by rail or affordable flights, elderly passengers who don't drive and can't navigate the complexity and cost of last-minute air travel. People in mid-sized cities that have no major airport and no Amtrak station, and whose connection to the broader transportation network depended on a bus that stopped showing up. For these passengers, the text message informing them that Megabus no longer existed was not an inconvenience to be managed. It was a genuine, immediate crisis with no obvious solution. By November 2024, the Renco Group had completed the purchase of Megabus's intellectual property and remaining subsidiaries. The brand name survived the bankruptcy in the technical sense that someone now owned the trademark. The network it had once represented, 120 cities, 60 million passengers, a revolution in American transportation, did not. On December 31, 2024, New Year's Eve, Coach USA and all of its subsidiaries converted from Chapter 11 reorganization to Chapter 7 liquidation. Chapter 11 means you're trying to survive. Chapter 7 means it's over. The assets are sold, the debts are settled as best they can be, and the company ceases to exist in any meaningful operational sense. In Britain, the timeline was slightly different, but the ending was identical. Stagecoach had sold its North American operations in 2019. The UK Megabus brand was transferred to Scottish CityLink in 2022. In December 2025, the last Megabus in Britain made its final run. The double-deckers named after British cultural figures went quiet. 22 years after that first £1 bus to Oxford, it was done. Chapter 8. What Megabus's collapse actually tells us. Here's the question that the headline version of this story never quite gets to. And it's the one that matters most if you want to understand not just what happened to Megabus, but what the Megabus story reveals about how we've decided to structure the transportation systems that ordinary people depend on. The people who ran Megabus were not incompetent. The demand they had identified was real. Millions of Americans genuinely needed and wanted affordable inner-city bus travel, and many of them still do. The model, at its core, was not fundamentally broken. What killed Megabus was a specific combination of structural vulnerabilities that no individual decision within the company could have fully prevented. And understanding those vulnerabilities requires looking at the system the company was operating within rather than just the decisions it made inside that system. When your entire value proposition is the lowest possible price, when cheapness is not a feature but the feature, the single most important thing you offer, you have almost no margin for error when external conditions shift. Rising fuel prices hurt you more than they hurt airlines because fuel constitutes a larger share of your costs, and your customers are so price-sensitive that you cannot pass those increases through without losing them. A pandemic devastates you more than it devastates Amtrak because Amtrak has public funding and political protection, and you have neither. A better-funded, structurally lighter competitor like Flixbus can match your prices while carrying none of your overhead, which means you're in a war of attrition with an opponent whose cost structure is more durable than yours. The curbside model that made your growth possible quietly erodes the customer experience that would have generated loyalty when the competition arrived. The private equity acquisition loads the balance sheet with debt at precisely the worst possible moment in the history of modern travel. And the policy environment ensures that when crisis arrives, you face it with far less institutional support than the industry competitors you've been outperforming for 15 years. There is a larger question buried in all of this, one that extends well beyond the story of a single company. The intercity bus serves, disproportionately, the people with the fewest alternatives. When a private company provides that service well and makes money doing it, we celebrate the efficiency of markets and the innovation of entrepreneurship. When that same company collapses under structural pressures that public policy helped create, by funding competitors generously while funding private bus operators minimally, by allowing the policy environment to treat low-income transportation as a private sector problem rather than a public infrastructure obligation, we mostly move on and wait for the next entrepreneurial attempt to fill the gap. Megabus proved that the demand exists. 60 million passengers is not a niche market or a temporary anomaly. It is an enormous, sustained expression of genuine need for affordable, dignified intercity transportation that the existing options were not meeting. The company that identified and served that need is gone. Flixbus is filling some of the gaps with a model that faces many of the same structural pressures that brought Megabus down, and the question of whether it will face them more successfully or simply encounter the same ending on a different timeline is one that nobody in a position to influence the outcome seems to be treating with urgency. The dollar fare is gone. The blue and yellow buses have cleared most American streets. The 120 cities and the 60 million passengers and the double-deckers that proved an entire generation of Americans wrong about what a bus trip could feel like. All of it dissolved in a bankruptcy filing and a Tuesday text message. The road is still there. The demand is still there. The people who needed what Megabus provided are still there, navigating whatever alternatives remain available to them. What they're not getting is a genuine public conversation about whether a country that subsidizes aviation and passenger rail and highway infrastructure has any obligation to ensure that the transportation option disproportionately used by people with the fewest choices is treated as infrastructure rather than as a business opportunity that the market is free to provide or withdraw as profitability dictates. Megabus answered the question of whether people wanted to ride the bus. That answer was 60 million times yes. The question it left unanswered, the one that its collapse makes more urgent rather than less, is who we think should be responsible for making sure the bus actually shows up. If stories like this one, about the companies and systems that shape the lives of ordinary people in ways that rarely make the front page, are what brought you here, subscribe to Global Status, and we'll keep delivering them. See you in the next one.